This Choircast podcast episode is brought to you by Heretic Happy Hour, whose tagline is burning questions, not people. Join hosts Sean DeJaw, December Rose, Dr. Reverend Katie Valentine, Keith Giles, and myself, Matthew J. Distefano, for a happy hour filled with quality conversation, fine fellowship, and perhaps even a laugh or two. Unapologetically irreverent and crass, yet sometimes profound, we make sure to pull no punches and leave no stones unturned as we discuss the Christian faith. But listener, beware. There will assuredly be some serious sacred cow tipping. If that sounds like your cup of tea, or bourbon if that's your thing, head on over to heretichappyhour.com to stay up to date with us, and be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcast fix.
Western Christianity has spent the last 2,000 years telling everyone they're separated from God.
This is Not Church with John and Nat Turney.
Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the podcast. This is Nat Turney, one of your two hosts. Don't forget that on this show, you get two hosts for the price of one. My name is Nat. My brother John is in the upper left-hand corner of the Hollywood Squares. Say hi, John.
Hi, John.
And literally nobody listening will know who the hell what the hell the Hollywood Squares are. But John's comfortably up in the center left square. Or
I can't be in the center square? Whatever.
Is there such I just made up a whole square, center left, center right. Anyway, John actually at some point turned this whole introduction thing over to me because presumably I'm better at it. I just keep proving him wrong every single time I do this. So one day he'll pick it back up again. We have an awesome guest with us. This is not the first time we've talked to this guy, but Matt Distefano's here with us. Say hi, Matt.
What's going on? How are you?
Well, we're good, man. We have most people who listen to the podcast, or I should say at least a lot of people who listen to the podcast are familiar with you. But if you're not familiar with Matt, Matt is a best-selling author. He's written a ton of books. Most recently, Don't Be a Dick, which is just an awesome name for any book that you would find in your local Christian bookstore. The other one is The Genesis of Violence, which is an amazing graphic work with illustrations by Zach Parsons, right?
That's correct, yeah.
Yeah, and it's that's amazing. Maybe we can chat about that for a minute. Also, multiple things in the works as well. So, like a lot of guys, he's just got many irons in the fire. So, welcome back to the podcast, Matt. What's up, bud?
What's going on? Yeah, they don't tell you like in school. Your school counselor never tells you, hey, you're going to have like 12 jobs. They just say, what's your career going to be? And it's like, how about I just do all of it?
Yeah.
So that's what I've been doing.
You've been doing your 12 jobs on top of all the content you provide and all the things that you do. And
pretty much.
Being a husband and a father and an all around, dissident, the kind of guy that just gets in trouble a lot. Well,
I don't know. I attract some interesting folks.
Yeah, you do. Maybe we should do a little segment about all of I have never seen anybody besides David Hayward who gets more vicious, hateful bullshit mail from folks. People just randomly feel like they need to tell you how they feel about you, right?
Yeah, David's an interesting case because David is a lot. I mean, he has a much larger following than I do on like Instagram and things like that. So he must get inundated. But I love some of the comments. I have to respect some of the comments that he and I get, just in how creative some trolls and haters can be. It's like, this is so good. I have to put this on a book somewhere because it's like the grammar. Normally trolls, they don't use grammar. They type in all caps, but sometimes people come around and it's like, this is well written. Bravo. Like I have to tip my cap to you.
I like that David took to like posting some of those and making Instagram posts, just something nasty and hateful somebody sent to him. And he's like, hey, thanks for the endorsement. I really apprecithink that.
No, I would love to see him on some like inspirational quotes with like a eagle flying in the background or something.
There you go.
Yeah, I think I think lean into it, man. It's pretty good. Any attention is good attention, I guess. But John and I got a very long email. I haven't read it yet, but John got it yesterday, warning us and expressing concern for us that we were too LGBTQ affirming. And
like TOO, like you should affirm them, or us, I should say, but not too much.
No. Yeah. I think any affirmation for this person was too much, or maybe they just misunderstood us. And so John's going to write an email back that said, "Nope." He's like, "How do I tactfully respond?" You don't tactfully respond to that. You just tell them they're full of shit and go on. So, but again, we get our one email, and I'm sure you get dozens. But
we received 73 voicemails on our hotline at one point for the Heretic Happy Hour. So if you can beat that, I applaud you.
From one person?
Yeah. So one
Holy
person
shit.
left 73 voicemails, and so I mixed it and chopped it up and put music to it, and we had a whole episode on Heretic Happy Hour for it was like a 35-minute episode of him just ranting and raving about us, and then we're like, well, that's the show, and that's the
end. That's the best.
I love it.
Hey, if you're going to put it out there, it's free to use.
Yeah, this is a public. Yeah, it's public. At that point.
Where were we? Yes, don't be a dick. Which, by the way, will make a great title for the episode, John. Don't be a dick with Matt J. So, let's talk about that. Then, that's an open-ended question. How about that? My interviewing skills.
Yeah, fantastic.
Right.
Way to ask leading questions. Yeah, I mean, so I've written a bunch of theological books, right? And sometimes theology and philosophy is kind of ivory tower-ish. And I'm like, honestly, I've already outed myself. So I'll say it again here. I don't really care about theology that much any longer. So I'm just more interested in practical application things. Like, how do I live my life? My best friend, Mike Machuga, and I have talked about getting rid of eternal torment as a doctrine was really helpful for where we were. Universalism was really helpful in being able to actually enjoy the present moment because you didn't have hell looming over you. But then it's now what? So don't be a dick is kind of what do you do in the day to day to make the world better? You can't change. I can't fix climate change, right? I can't end the homeless crisis. I can't stop war, but I can do my part. And there's a great Gandalf quote about you master the tides in your own, in your own spaces. You make sure the earth is tilled in your own. What weather happens is kind of out of your control, right? So all we can do is do our part in our own little space. And so that there are 69, pardon the crassness, 69 practical applications for making the world a better place. That's basically all it is.
No, that's interesting because I think my experience parallels that somewhat because, there was a time in my life when theology dominated, you know what I mean? Even in my, my very initial deconstruction was deconstructing bad doctrine.
That's it.
I spent a lot of time reading Girard and reading things like that and hanging out with people who are doing hardcore theology. And I'm in a place right now where I don't give a shit anymore either. I care, but I care less. You know what I mean? It's definitely secondary to what you just talked about.
Yeah. It's beliefs matter, but ultimately they don't. So they matter in how you're going to approach the world and how you're going to experience the world. But at the end of the day, you aren't your beliefs. And so just do well, do good things, be kind, show empathy, show compassion, and the theological stuff will work itself out. I think you need to have decent theology in order to do that because, I mean, obviously the people who are the most bigoted and hateful and spiteful do have generally pretty shitty theology. So there is kind of a correlation there. But now that I don't have harmful theology and the theology that I do hold is very loosely, so now it's well, how do I just be a decent human being?
Yeah. I remember in my earlier stages of deconstruction when I was very, very, I just was consumed with some of this stuff. I talked to anybody all the time, anytime I could, who sort of shared that point of view. And some of it was just to validate my own thoughts. Some of it was just to find out there were more people out there that believe what I believe. And then after a while, it just got to a point where we were just in this echo chamber of people who all thought the same way. And I just got tired of rehashing the same stuff. You know what I mean?
Yeah, sure.
And so I completely lost interest in arguing with people. And then I lost interest in even listening to people who agreed with me just because, okay, now what? I'm in that same stage, I think, that you are. It's what you believe will absolutely inform the things that you do. But once you get past that place, there were Facebook groups I was a part of that I was really active in that I'm loosely, if at all, connected to anymore. Because how many times can you hash out the doctrine of hell? Once you've kicked it to the curb, it's, okay, now what? So I appreciate that. Don't you find that too? David Hayward's come up twice now, but one of my favorite cartoons of his is one it's just a graph. It's just a graph, and the two axes are, one is how theologically correct you think you are, and then on the bottom is how much of a dick you are.
Yeah, I got tagged in a lot of that because my book came out around the same time that came out, and people were like, "Hey, Matt."
Yeah. So So those people that I've found who are the most entrenched, I mean, that seems to go hand in hand, doesn't it? I mean, the more dogmatic you are, I mean, it feels like you're 100%. Just, yeah. So we just actually summed up your whole book in just one. I'm kidding.
No, it's really kind of, I mean, there's some like profound things I think in the book, but a lot of it's really just mundane shit we don't think about. I mean, I don't want to it's a total undersell, right? My book is very mundane. No, I think the writing it's comical. I try to write it from a funny standpoint, and I'm just super self-deprecating, which I think anyone writing any sort of comedy has to be self-deprecating. But I mean, it's as simple as like, putting your shopping cart back and doing all these little things that maybe we don't think about, making sure we pick up our trash, making sure we put things back on the, on the shelves, which I if I don't want something, I have a tendency to just put it where I am, right? Instead of putting it back on the shelf. But if you don't do your part, someone else got to pick up the slack. And that's the case with anything. Like if you don't put your shopping cart, someone's got to pick it up. So maybe someone's pulling in, maybe a handicapped person is pulling in and they can't park close to the store because you're too much of a dick and you put your shopping cart, right in the middle of the stall there, instead of putting it back, then you're just being a dick. You're making someone's day worse, and you don't know where people are. You don't know where people are with their mental health, with all these things that we just assume everyone's fine because we're in a culture of fine. But maybe the thing that you do that is so mundane is the straw that breaks the camel's back. And why would you want to be that? Why do you want to impact the world in that way? Because, there's so much mental health going on. Like someone could be at their wit's end and it's your little tiny bit of dickishness that just sends them over the top and then just send them spiraling down. And
conversely, that one little act of kindness.
Exactly.
Is sometimes what that person needs to go, okay, like not everyone's an asshole.
Right.
Okay, there are decent people left. So
exactly.
Yeah. I work in the retail industry and these last couple of years have been pretty difficult. People are overstressed for very good reasons. And I try, and there are days where I end up being a dick, but what I try is to come at it by, I don't know what got them to this point, that they seem to be flipping out over something really, really not that big a deal.
Right.
To the point where they feel the need to cuss me out and yell at me. Yeah. And so I try really hard just to be a sounding board, let them, it kind of sucks sometimes because no one wants to be yelled at, but
right.
In a retail environment, we do have to take a little bit of that brunt. But at the end of it, more often than not, they just need someone to yell at for a minute, and then they go on with their day, and I go on with my day. And it's better than yelling back because all that does is escalate, right?
Yeah, and it doesn't like diminish that they're being a dick as well, right?
Right.
But a point I make in the book is like, don't meet someone's dickishness with your own dickishness, right? You can, it's kind of like ending the cycle right there. And that doesn't mean that you're a doormat or anything. It just means that, you have to be mindful about how you respond to people who are being assholes.
It feels like kind of the book in the way you write it, which is funny, but also there's this like psychological shift if you read it and take it to heart, right? Because I think it's doing those simple things repeatedly, right?
Right.
And then there's this psychological shift in your brain that you're like, oh, I can do these little things and I can help and I can make someone's day a little bit better. And I might not know. And that's, I think, part of the point, right? Is it's not my job to know if I made their day better.
Right.
It's just my job to not be the dick that made their day worse.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. And we're such ritualistic, everyone who says like, I'm not religious, it's like, yeah, you are, because you don't have to have a God to be religious. We're all religious in a way. If we define religion, a part of religion is having rituals. We're all very ritualistic in some sort of way.
Right.
So I think the point is to replace our bad ritualistic behavior with good ritualistic behavior to where we're not even thinking about the things that we're doing. I wouldn't have even thought about what I did earlier had we not been talking about this, but I was walking my shopping cart back and someone was done unloading and I was just like, hey, I'll grab that for you and take it back. It might have made that person's day. They may never think about it again. And John, you're right. The point isn't like, I wonder if that really helped them. It's just like, just do those things naturally and eventually it'll just become second nature to you. And it'll just be, you find out maybe a year from now, you're less of a dick than you were last year. That's my goal in the introduction. It's like, I want to be, what I put in the book, I want to be less of a dick after I'm done reading this and putting things into practice. It doesn't mean I'm not going to be a dick ever. I'm sure 100% that I'm a dick every now and then. But hopefully it's like there's a trajectory towards being less of one.
Yeah. Well, that's an interesting thing, because that's one of those things that what I find problematic within the Christian community is people want to do that kind of stuff when people are looking.
Yeah.
They want to give the guy, on the corner $1 and take a selfie with him and post it. And so that just detracts from any goodness, I think, that was created there. So I like the approach of just trying to put some of this stuff into practice to the point where you're just doing it automatically. I live in Texas. Say what you will about Texas. Generally, people are fairly kind in some ways, and in ways like you're describing, like let me hold the door for you. Let me take this card for you. They can be hateful in other more obtrusive ways, but
sure.
But it does. But having moved from the East Coast to Texas, it took me a little bit, because you can get used to that East Coast detachedness, right? There's a very much hey, F you, do your thing, I'm going to do my thing, and there's I don't think there's anything malicious behind it. It's just a culture thing, and so we spent the first year in Texas going, all right, what the hell is your angle? Like, why are you being nice to me?
Exactly. Yeah. Right? What do you want from me?
We were driving through some little town, and couldn't tell you where it was at all, but it was my wife and my 4 kids and I, right? And we're moving to Texas. And I remember stopping into a gas station, and my wife goes in with 4 kids in tow, and they all want something, and they're grabbing stuff. And I had filled the truck up and was waiting outside, I think. And she had like $7 in her pocket and $4 or $5 short for what she needed. And some guy walked up and just paid for everything.
Yeah.
And then, and she walked out the door, and it made her day. It was a small thing. It was a tiny little thing. And of course, having just come from where we did, I was like, okay, what does that dude after? What's he want? It took me a while to take it at face value. But yeah, those little random acts of kindness, paying for someone's drink behind you in the Starbucks line, which is, either here nor there, but yeah, good stuff. So I appreciate that, man. So the other book, though, that we did want to discuss, I know we went from saying we don't care too much about theology, but Genesis of Violence is, if I'm understanding correctly, pretty heavily theological in exploring some Girardian type stuff and origins of violence.
Yeah. And it's funny because I wrote it like 5 years ago when I was really heavy into theology, and, the art for it took a long time because, Zach, the artist, has jobs like we all do, and kind of did his art when he could. So it took 4 or 5 years to push this out. So I'm really happy that it got released. I think it's kind of like an interesting, one of a kind book. And it's kind of, of course, it's my interpretation of the book of Genesis. And I think anytime you talk Bible, you're going to talk interpretation, right? The evangelicals will tell you they're not interpreting it, but they are. So this is just my interpretation of it. I think it's a creative interpretation, but I don't think that's a bad thing. So yeah, it's heavily Girardian. It's heavy into mimetic theory and kind of the origins of human violence, and kind of the redemptive reconciliatory trajectory that the book takes. When you get to Jacob and Esau, and then Joseph and his brothers, and to stem the tide of violence that we see early on in the book of Genesis, there has to be someone who breaks that cycle. And so with Jacob and Esau, they have to make a decision to reconcile, and they do, right? And Joseph has to make the decision to forgive his brothers and to not be retributive when their father dies, because that's what they're afraid of. So he has to, and it's funny because the prophecy about all of his brothers kind of bowing down to him is only fulfilled after he shows them forgiveness, right? And that's the act that causes that. So my argument is that you have like the gospel, and I'm not talking the Calvinist gospel, I'm talking about the actual gospel in Genesis. You have a lot of, other stuff too going on. A lot of violence, a lot of bloodshed, a lot of sacrifice, a lot of shit. But I think though, if you take the step back and see the overarching narrative, you have this trajectory away from violence, and here's how we get away from violence. Even Abraham and Isaac, like if, to get super nerdy, like the word for God that is pro-sacrifice, go, take Isaac up to the mountain. That's a different word than then the sacrifice is stopped, right? So it's an angel of Yahweh comes and stops the sacrifice. And that to me is a linguistic hint that something's going on here in the text that's going to tell us, I know that God says this, because that's the context, right? That's the assumption back in the day. I know God says this, however, our God says to stop it, right? So that's what I'm trying to do in the book. And I think Zach does a brilliant job of taking my interpretation and then interpreting it, distilling it down even further into a graphic. So it is kind of this graphic novel sort of thing. People have asked me, is it a children's book? It's absolutely not a children's book, because it's like super gruesome. If you've read Genesis, it's super gruesome, super bloody, and super awesome.
Yeah. Well, the Bible's not a kid's book either. So we stop shoving that down our kids' throats, going and painting scenes from Noah's Ark on their nursery walls. Holy shit.
Yeah. I just wrote an article about like where God was not pro-life, because we've got this whole abortion shit that's going on. And it's like, I mean, it doesn't say it in the text, but it stands to reason that there's pregnant teenage moms that are drowned in Noah's flood. I mean, let's just be real. Someone's pregnant at that point and they die because of a flood that God sent. So just a literalist reading of the text, it's like, no, this God is very violent. Now, I think, there's assumptions when we read the text like that. Like, I don't see perfect theology there, but most people who are anti-abortion, let's say, do. So what do we do with stuff like that?
Yeah. No, and when you've painted yourself into a corner where you think that every word in that book is literally true, right? Then you really have a reckoning, don't you? I mean, because then you really have 100%. To explain God's pro-life stance, and of course they do it easily enough. Though they're fairly deft at this, aren't they? Because then they just go back to that whole thing of, well, God did it, therefore it's okay, because that's anything God does is fine.
His ways are higher than our ways.
Yes.
That bullshit.
Yahweh's.
No way, Yahweh. But then at that point we have like linguistic and ethical nihilism, because then what we call good cannot necessarily be good, and we're just talking mumbo jumbo at that point. We can't even communicate, because if God does something that we would call bad if we did it, but because God did it, it is good, right? Then therefore we can't even have a conversation, because we can't establish our terms,
right? Yeah, there's no frame of reference for what there's no objective goodness at all. Then, right?
No, absolutely not.
And then that's one of those things that when you argue with, when you talk to atheists, because the standard diatribe against atheism is, how can you know right from wrong without God? And the fact of the matter is, you absolutely can know. What are you talking about? There are plenty of morally upright people who don't give a rip about God one way or the other. They still know it's wrong to do A, B, C, or whatever it is. And then when we further muddy the waters and say, but when my God decides, if you pull a John Piper deal and go like, hey, if God decides to,
oh man, now dog's gonna get kicked.
Piper, screw you. But bridge collapses in Minnesota and sends 50 people to their icy deaths in the water below, and God is somehow not just responsible but glorified in what happens. Yeah, you're right. We're not even speaking the same language anymore.
We can't. I mean, in like in the Jacques Derrida sense of the word deconstruction, we don't even have a unity of text at that point. Like, we cannot even talk to each other because our definitions are diametrically opposed.
Right.
Because we would call, like, it's the William Lane Craig sort of apologetic that anything God does is good because God does it. And it's like, okay, but we would diametrically oppose that and say that a person who did that is evil.
Right. And God would say that too.
Of course. Yeah. But so at what point do we have to just like throw our hands up and say, yeah, we can't even talk to people like that because it's only going to lead to a headache. We literally cannot communicate.
Right. Just for shits and giggles, those who aren't familiar with Derrida, do you have a Cliff Notes version of, because I know we've hijacked this term deconstruction, or at least we've certainly, in some ways, I think we're applying it appropriately somewhat, but I know Derrida's meaning of that word is not what we've attached to it.
Yeah, so we're actually doing something Derridian in a way, like like, so deconstruction just, I think, meant like, I mean, Derrida is very difficult to read.
Very difficult.
It's been a long time since I've read him. From what I understand, like the basic understanding is that we deconstruct words and meanings to where we can have we can communicate what these things mean. in our context, right? So we have to have what's called a unity of text. When we're saying things, we have to like look at one another and say, okay, we both understand what we're saying here. We've deconstructed that term that he used to now make it mean something different, which is I think appropriate in the truest sense of the word deconstruction. So now it sort of means we're challenging our faith. We're picking apart our assumptions theologically, and we're wrestling through them, and we're abandoning them in many instances, and then quote unquote reconstructing something new. And I think that as long as that's our unity of text, that's fine. But it didn't originally mean that, though that's what it typically means now. And now it's a buzzword, and which is fine. But I think a lot of times even that is problematic, because when I hear evangelicals like Alyssa Childers or Josh McDowell use the term deconstruction and then tell us what it means, that's not generally what people are going through. So they'll warn people against deconstruction, say what it is. And those of us who have deconstructed our, evangelical faith are like, no, there are bits and pieces that are correct in what you're saying, but most of that, we don't have a unity of text now. We don't have a unity of meaning because you're misrepresenting what that experience is for most of us.
It's them taking a term that they don't even understand. Right. They haven't taken, and you've talked about this before, where they've taken this idea of what we call deconstruction. I didn't use that word because I apparently did this so long ago. There was no word for deconstruction, and they're not taking the time to figure out what exactly is going on. They're just deciding that they're going to use the word in a way to attack.
The most absurd example of that was that dude whose name I've already forgotten, but the lead singer for that, whatever.
Oh, yes.
Christian band.
Frying Pan.
Yeah, Frying Pan. And his whole thing, it was like you have no, you just don't even have any understanding. You just created a caricature of something you want to easily knock down. You've created this 2-dimensional thing of, hey, all you people, you were never Christians to begin with, and yada, yada, yada. But you get that same kind of stuff no matter what the issue is, don't you? You get your position. That's one of the things that I've appreciated about you so much, Matt, is you've helped me in a way to, I've seen you deal with your interlocutors in a way that is respectful. And I've not seen you like create 2-dimensional caricatures of their ideas just so you can destroy them easily, right? I've actually seen you present them well and say, listen,
I try to. There are times when you kind of do on accident. Like if I say, hey, evangelicals, and then someone will come in and say, I'm an evangelical and I don't believe that. And it's like, okay, then I'm not necessarily talking to you. It's like, we all fall for this trap of like, if you say something that I identify with, then I like take it to heart and I want to say, well, not all. We do it with like, not all white people or not all men. It's like, well,
okay, but enough of them.
But enough of them that we're, not everything has to be a thesis. If you're making a blog post or something, you're not going to have to, I don't mean this. I mean this group who does this. And it's like, okay, well, just for sake of simplicity, conservative Christians or evangelicals, and try to present it fairly. The one I probably do strawman the most is Calvinism. But to be fair, I've read enough Calvin to know that I don't think modern Calvinists are reading enough Calvin.
I agree.
Going back to the John Piper thing, it's like, well, no, God doesn't do that stuff. He just has foreknowledge of it or this. And it's like, no, actually, Calvin said that everything is like God dictates everything, even all the evil. Like I use quotes that he says that in my books, and it's like, maybe you should read Calvin more if you're a Calvinist, because he literally says that shit.
Yeah, I've got a friend who's a Presbyterian pastor, and I love him. He's a great guy. And if I ever comment or post about Calvinism, I immediately get a response. Hey, well, actually, and I'm like, no, actually, Calvin said this. You may not agree with it. And that's fine that you don't follow everything Calvin says just because you're a Presbyterian. I get that. But let's not play games with some of the horrendous shit that guy, just read it. If you can plow your way through Institutes, which I have yet to do all the way, there's enough ammo there to go, nah, that's pretty horrifying. There's some stuff in there that's, and I'll pull a quote or two out that I'm like, we found some common ground on one thing. But every once in a while, we like to play that game where you go, hey, used to play that game where you pull a quote, and I had a game I used to play with a guy who was like, was it Jesus or Hitler? You know, there was some stuff out there, man. It's like Hitler said some things once in a while that was like, you know, not totally batshit crazy. You can't say that or post it and like, hey, this is a nifty little, memeable quote from Adolf Hitler. But,
just open a burner Twitter account. It's just Jesus or Hitler. Just post quotes and people have to guess. You'll be banned so quick. Well, maybe not now that Elon Musk is
now I'll just be celebrated. I'll probably have 10,000 followers by the end of the day. But,
probably.
It's crazy, man. It's absolutely crazy. But the straw man thing is one thing that I've noticed that a lot when there's just people dealing with stuff they don't understand at all, and it's easier just to create some fictional thing. Anyway, yeah. So for those of you who are interested and ever want to try, and what Matt said is absolutely correct. Derrida's hard to read. I actually first heard that name from Peter Rollins, and I was listening to a podcast he was on, and he brought him. And I was like, I'd much rather listen to Peter, to Pete talk about Derrida than actually try and read through that stuff. It's difficult, but.
Yeah. And again, it's been so long since I've read like that or Hegel I used to be way into all that shit. Even Girard, like I haven't read Girard in forever, so it's like, again, I'm moving past the sort of like, let's put out a defense of some doctrine or this and that. Like the next couple of books that I'm writing, I wrote one with Michelle about my deconstruction story. And I've got a book called The Wisdom of Hobbits coming out where I talk about all the good and some of the bad that Tolkien's characters, the hobbits have, that they bring to the table. And I'm just kind of trying to do different shit like that and create interesting content without the heavy theological stuff.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about the Tolkien thing then, because that has intrigued me a bunch. So are you using pretty much the entirety of the Tolkien universe, or are you kind of focusing in on Lord of the Rings, or?
Yeah, so I'm using the entire legendarium as it's known. I've read most of it. There's some tales and some of the unfinished tales that I haven't read, but most of those have nothing to do with hobbits. Most of the stuff on hobbits is from The Hobbit, obviously, and The Lord of the Rings. But there's a lot of other stuff that I'm talking about from the Silmarillion and things like that, a bunch of his letters. And I'm just putting forth, I think, like an understanding of what it means to be human, of things that we can learn, pros and cons that we can learn from hobbits. So I'm talking about, hobbits are very insular. So that's one of their negatives. And they have a distrust of outsiders. They have a bit of xenophobia. But the hobbits that, go outside the borders of the Shire, kind of lose that. And so how do we apply that to our lives? Well, that applies to immigration policies, right? That applies to coming in contact with LGBT people. So how can we apply those things today? So how can we apply Tolkien's view of the ecology that, in a time of climate change and deforestation and the Pacific garbage patch? I think Tolkien presents kind of two ways, like the ways of Saruman and Isengard and what their end is. They all end up in ruin, right? Or the ways of hobbits, which are more agrarian and, one with the earth. And I think it's symbolic that they even live in the earth most of the time, like they build their homes into the earth itself. So I think all these things, this wisdom found in like the simplicities of life, which hobbits are very simple, I think applied, in our world makes it a better place.
Well, you even do that within your own lifestyle, right? I mean, you some of the pictures I've seen recently of you kind of redoing your garden. For the people that don't know, it was in Paradise, right? The garden you were working on. Yeah.
So in Paradise, I live in Chico, California, right. And my best friend Mike Machuga, who is a co-author of the Bonfire Sessions, he lives in Paradise, which is like 15 minutes away. And we have like an acre of land up there, and we had, a vineyard and an orchard, and we had a big garden, and it burned down in the 2018 campfire, where it basically took out like 85% of the town. And so it's kind of like the scouring of the Shire at the end of The Return of the King, where the Shire is completely laid to waste because of Saruman, who, spoiler alert, doesn't die in the Two Towers in the books. In the films, I know he does, but so it's kind of paralleled there. So we just redid his entire property, huge garden, like a permaculture focus. We have a vineyard. We have a orchard, and the weather hasn't cooperated. So it's been a slow start to this year, but it's finally back. We're making sure we're composting everything. We're applying the basic tenets of what it means to be a hobbit in the real world to see how that works on our little plot of land that we use as a, community garden type thing it's a small community. It's just us, but on his property, and just the joy of growing your own food is phenomenal.
Yeah. I have, my wife and I, we have a small garden, that we enjoy. It's very, very small, but it's a learning process, right? I mean, even because I didn't know how to garden, other than Nat and I had a grandfather who was quite the gardener, and we were raised around that, but we never really learned anything other than how to help him go pick the fruits of his labor. We didn't really get the other side of it, and I really wish I had talked to him more about that. But there is something really genuine about returning to the land and getting back into like a oneness with nature. And I live on 23 acres, and it's beautiful, and we've got a nice creek that runs through our property, and it's really
when
nice.
Are we starting our commune, man? Come on.
You never know. It might have to happen. But,
everyone else out there is growing weed. John, you might as well start.
That's right. I don't need to. I got so many people around me.
That's true.
But, it's like I have a friend that I'm in conversation with. He's going to bring up bees. We're going to start raising bees up here.
Right.
He wants to start this certain type of blackberry patch, but I'm like, they're really invasive. I don't really want to do that to my property because they take over so quickly.
Yeah, it's like the one thing that we can't get rid of in our garden, and in many places in the property, there's huge blackberry bushes, and that's fine. It's along a fence or it's on the edge of the property, but they are the most invasive, I think, of the species that we have. Yeah. So even though it sounds really interesting, and they're thornless berries, so you can like reach in there and grab as many berries as you want. It's like I'm gonna have to say no to that one because I don't want it all over my property. Right.
But side note, really quick, and Nat will remember this, and this might be interesting to you. So just with the idea of Hobbiton, right, the village of where the hobbits live. When Nat and I were kids, our grandparents lived in a little town called Phillipsville on the Avenue of the Giants. And Nat, do you remember the little Hobbit village?
I do, fondly. Yeah. They called it Hobbiton. Go figure.
Yeah.
Now, this was the 70s. This was the height of, honestly, I think before the movies, obviously, in the 70s, that was like Tolkien was everywhere. They'd come up with the cartoons, and so everyone was capitalizing on the Hobbit craze.
Yeah. Yeah. And where was this?
It was in a little town, not even a town. I mean, a little village.
Yeah. There's a little town. So have you ever heard of the Avenue of the Giants? It's a stretch of Highway 101 that goes right through the heart of the Redwoods.
Right. Is it like south of Monterey?
Oh, yeah. Way north. Way north.
Way north. Oh, it's up there. Okay, up that way.
Humboldt County. Okay, yeah. So we're talking from like Garberville to Myers Flat or so. Anyway, but it's a stretch of, it used to be an old logging highway. Now it's just called the Avenue of the Giants. If you ever get up that way, it's one of the most spectacular drives you'll ever take because it just drives right through the heart of these massive redwood trees. And there's a few little small towns left on that avenue. And where my grandparents lived was a little tiny town called Phillipsville, like 200 people. Most of the, probably 80% of those lived in a trailer park. Now, interestingly enough, this was a town of 200 people with 3 bars, which was pretty impressive. Was there 3? There was the bar we drank at. Remember the bar that when we were kids, there was a bar that would serve us called the Saw Blade Tavern, which was just a hell of a lot of fun. We'd go shoot pool, and they'd give us a beer once in a while. Anyway, but small, very, very small little town. But there was that little. Isn't that where Hobbiton was too? Wasn't that?
No, it was a little bit farther down. It was near the Riverwood Inn.
Yeah, the Riverwood Inn. There you go. See, but it was neat. It was it made me want to go like. Actually, there was times, John. Don't you remember going down to the river and trying to make hobbit holes? Like we dug these big holes in the ground. We were trying to make our own little hobbit habitats, man. So I've been fascinated with Tolkien and Lord of the Rings and stuff most of my life. I mean, so
I'm a total nerd. My wife makes fun of me, and I'm okay with it.
Yeah, no, I'm fine. We're all nerds about something, right? I mean,
that's right.
Pick something, you'll nerd out on it. But because speaking of nerding out, don't you have something going too? Aren't you working something with the Office as well? Because I also nerd out on the Office quite a bit.
I am, yes, and John is a part of it as well. So I can't really give too much details on it just because it's we're still waiting on some essays from some contributors, but essentially I'm putting together a collection of essays where different contributors look at a character or a plot line through the lens of Joseph Campbell's The Hero's Journey. We think of Lord of the Rings or Star Wars universe when it comes to Hero's Journey, Luke Skywalker, things like that. I'm trying to take a more this Hero's Journey is applicable, I think, to everyone's lives. So let's look at the most popular television show, which my wife and I are obsessed over for the last 15 years or whatever, and look at those characters' journeys, because it seems to me that, Dwight and Jim and Pam and Oscar and Michael take journeys of sorts, right? I mean, Michael Scott, for instance, in season 1 is the most unredeemable character in the history of television.
Unbelievable.
No one roots for him. Extremely cringe without any redeemable qualities. Like, the episodes just end and you're like, fuck this guy. and then by season 7, no one is not crying when he leaves, right?
Yeah.
And everyone is rooting for him and Holly. Spoiler alert. That's on you if you haven't seen it.
They get together. It's okay.
At this point, it's okay. So what is it about their journeys that, Dwight is the same way. Who would really root for Dwight and Angela in the real world?
Right.
But we get to know these characters so well that you're like, okay, there is an arc, and it seems to be a theme. And so, wonderful contributors, John, a bunch of choir authors, some scholars are all kind of looking. Even my sister-in-law is. This is her first published writing that it will be published. So just a bunch of different people from different backgrounds, all looking at these characters, because we have one common thing. We love The Office, right? So I think it'll be an interesting, one of a kind project. And I hope to God that somehow it gets in the hands of some people involved with The Office, and, so that they can take a look at it, because I think I think it does justice to The Office. And I think anyone who loves The Office will read the book and go I gained a lot of insight into these characters that I knew, but maybe it was fleshed out hopefully more for them.
One of those things that struck me as weird about The Office was, I've seen it. I bet you have too. I've seen it all the way through multiple times. Right. And I noticed that at some point in my viewing, I kind of stopped rooting for Jim. He becomes through another lens you can see, Yeah, so he's painted as the guy that you want to root for the whole time. But there's times when you look back on those episodes and go, actually, you were an instigator in a lot of these things. You were kind of being an asshole.
Yeah, he has a bit of a bully tendency at times. And another character, along the same lines that we root against is Karen Filippelli.
Right.
And Karen does really nothing wrong, right? She's, her and Jim, for all intents and purposes, have a decent relationship. But in the background of that, we always want Jim and Pam to get together.
Right. So she's an obstacle.
And she's an obstacle, right? Yeah, she's an obstacle to this goal. And it's and we're really happy when he leaves her in fucking New York, right? Just leaves her. Right. Just and you're like, yeah. And it's wait a second. We should have some sort of empathy for this woman who's left in New York, goes on a trip to apply for the same job as her boyfriend. They go to a play. It looks like they're having fun. They see who from Saturday Night Live, one of the, some famous person. They have this wonderful, it seems like, little vacation, and he leaves her ass there, and we cheer it on.
Yeah.
But in the real world, it's no, that was kind of a dick move, dude.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you have the connection with Rainn Wilson, so I'm sure someone's going to get this in their hands. I would imagine.
I hope so. Yeah. We were able to have him on the podcast, and but these folks are so busy. So no beef if it doesn't work out. But
one of the greatest things I discovered in the last 2 months was that, and I'm not plugging for any streaming service or anything, but Peacock, who now owns The Office, right? Because it's an NBC deal. They've got the first 4 seasons of The Office, the Superfan episodes. Have you seen those?
Right. Oh yeah.
So I must have been late to the party. I was like, holy shit, I get to watch these again. And there's however many minutes of added stuff that they've put in context too, which I thought was better than here's a bunch of deleted scenes at the end of the show.
Yeah, which it's we're in an era now where most of these things, even the Lord of the Rings, The Office, if these things were not, I mean, like The Office, if it wasn't like a syndicated broadcast on NBC, if it was like straight to Netflix, you know, if it was 20 years later, right? If it came out 20 years later, I mean, you'd have like 40-minute episodes, right? You could have as lengthy episodes as you want. I mean, Lord of the Rings, if it was made, I mean, I like Peter Jackson's films, but it's a film. You have to cut some things down. Yeah. But if you did it as an episodic sort of thing and you went through and if it was like the book 100%, I mean, I think that would be even more profound and wonderful. But I love that Peacock has done that because the episodes are like 35 to 40 minutes. So it's basically double.
I love that they're longer, and I will watch every season that they add this to. So I'm hoping they're doing the rest of the seasons as they go along. But there is times where you're like, okay, I can see why that wasn't. I see why they cut that.
Did you notice how early on in that show they actually intended to reveal who Creed Bratton was? And that was a smart move, I think, to hold that back because it's in the first season. Or maybe the second season that they have these little outtakes with him where he's like, oh yeah, I used to be in this band called the Grassroots. And so you find out very early on that he's a real character, which I thought was brilliant to reveal way towards the end and go, oh shit, he's not just Creed Bratton. He's actually playing himself in this show. And that's amazing.
Yeah. So. Yeah. He's kind of like a hyperbolized version of himself.
Yeah. It was great.
I have one of their albums.
Yeah. Well,
on vinyl.
La, 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 live for today. Right. That's the Grassroots, right? So
I believe so.
Yeah. Interesting. Hey, another thing I want to talk about before we forget, is you're working also on a sequel to Heretic, which I didn't know about until we talked offline. So I'm really interested to see where do you go with that work? Are you sticking along the same vein of LGBTQ affirming, or are you moving on to another area of heresy that you want to, indoctrinate us into?
Yeah, my whole goal is just to indoctrinate people into my cult. Which I think is the greatest accusation of all time. Like we have no hierarchy, no structure. I'm not making any money.
I was going to say, if you're not getting rich, how can it be a cult, man?
Exactly. I think the only similarity is I do drugs. No, I smoke a little weed. That's it. It's one of those things. Like it keeps getting. Like kind of the theme of this episode is that we don't care about theology any longer. So it keeps getting pushed back by projects that I'm way more excited about. But at some point I have to release a follow-up because it's like, I don't want it to be like 30 years later and here's a follow-up. So it's just 10 more things. Like Heretic, I answer 10 questions from evangelicals that are most pressing to them apparently. So in this one, I just do the same thing. I don't know how I didn't do this. I didn't really talk about hell much in Heretic, so I talk about hell in it's called Apostates. So I've gone from heresy to apostasy. So I talk about hell, I talk about women in leadership and cover all that and what's biblical, what's not. All the things that I didn't get to cover, I try to cover in I talk about politics and how God's not a Republican. Breaking news. What else do I cover? There's 10 of them, and I'm like 6 chapters done. I talk about parenting, what parenting looks like after you've deconstructed, and a bunch of others. So I haven't written it all, but I would say that maybe in the next year I'll have it done. Hopefully.
Yeah. I'm envious of guys who are deconstructing or have deconstructed and still have kids to raise. Because if there's one thing I would go back and change, it would be my approach to child rearing would have been one of the ones that just took the biggest hit, and so I wish I'd known some of this. It's a tough one when you're saddled with an ideology that says essentially beat your kids or you're a bad parent. And so,
but it's also a tough one when you're kind of the breaking away from a mold as like the first generation to do so. Because I mean, my parents didn't hit me or spank me, but my wife's parents were very rigid in their, child rearing.
Yeah.
And also very distant at the same time. So there's that whole dynamic of emotionally distant, but physically like, I will spank you or I will hit you.
Right.
And very evangelical fundamentalist. So it's difficult. I mean, yes, it's good to break away from that, obviously, but it's difficult to be like, okay, now what? Yeah. Now how do I raise my kid so I love what Cindy Wang Brandt has done with her, what's her book? Parenting Forward or something like that. Unfundamentalist Parenting. something to that effect. So I love that there are groups like that and people like that thinking, okay, well, how do we then raise our kids? Because we don't want to raise our kids simply on what we're not, because that doesn't work. So we're not evangelicals. Okay, great. So what? So what are you, and how are you going to raise your kids? So I talk a little bit about that. In fact, some of the material I use from that is going into a book that Choir is doing. I think Jason Elam is. Am I allowed to say that? I don't know.
Yeah. John's actually contributed to that as well.
Yeah, so. I've contributed to that one as well.
Yeah, I didn't know if it was announced. I don't know what's announced or what.
I don't know either. But if it's breaking news for us, and so be it. Ralph can yell at us later.
I've got 7,000 hats and 7,000 different projects, and I don't know what's what sometimes. So
yeah, no, we had. Matter of fact, we had Jason and somebody else on to talk about that, didn't we, John?
I don't know if we talked about that. It was Jason and Eric.
Okay,
but I'm not sure we talked about. I think it came up. Yeah,
it might not have been the reason, but it certainly came up.
That's what she said.
Michael. Always so. Michael Distefano. I haven't changed it.
He's like, that's what who said. I never know. I never know.
That's one of those moments, isn't it? I remember, weirdly enough, I've just watched a lot of these episodes. There's the episode where he decides to go out and play Survivor. Right. And when he comes back, he has that very human moment with Jim. He's like, "Oh, you tried to do the birthday thing." He's like, "Yeah, I did that. Yeah, I did that too." Yeah, but there is that. You're right. That I like how, and I don't know if it was intentional, or if it just sort of unfolded that way. But as the series progresses, you do start to see, oh, this is actually a fairly decent human being.
Yeah, that was, from what I understand, on listening to like Brian Baumgartner's Deep Dive podcast and The Office Ladies, I think that was intentional by the writers, that in order for there to be longevity, and so they had to take the British humor into an American audience.
Right.
And from what I understand, the Ricky Gervais character, there's not much redeemable about him or the Dwight character.
Zero.
Yeah. So for that wouldn't work here. Right. And so for it to work, season 1 was hilarious. I mean, there's some, Diversity Day. I mean, some of those moments are just
so good.
Gold. But you can't build you couldn't build 9 seasons on that. So he had to have redeemable qualities, and that was intentional breaking through. And I think it was Greg Daniels who originally came up with that. And maybe there was, I think, a little bit of hesitance on that, because there was the worry that some of the cringe would be gone. But as we obviously know, plenty of cringe, even though Michael was redeemable.
Yeah. Well, it has to be one of the reasons. I wonder if that's one of the reasons why the British version of that, only lasted I think there's only 2 seasons in it.
I think it's 2. Yeah.
So, and I've watched, it is funny. But you're exactly right. After about the second, through the second season of that, it was like, I'm not sure how much more the second take.
It would be like Scott's Tots for an entire season.
Yeah. See, and that's one of my least favorite episodes, because there's just it's an abundance of cringe, man.
I love that, and I love the dinner party. My wife loves the dinner party, but if she had her druthers, I don't know what druthers means, but if she had them, she would skip Scott's Tots, and I'm like, no, I make her watch it.
See, I don't know. The dinner party is pretty rough too, man. It's just
it's so good. It's so. We sang one of our friends on voicemail. I learned how to play that stupid song.
I was going to say that's actually the song that's in my head right now. Just one night, you made everything all right.
So awkward. I mean, just imagine being there. How awkward that would be. Oh, it's glorious.
Oh man, I want to get a tiny plasma TV in one room of my house, just to show people, hey, look.
Have you seen the outtakes of that?
Yes.
You barely get through it on like the 90th try.
Yeah.
Oh man. Now we've devolved into complete Office fandom, fanboy.
Yeah. Totally.
But there's worse ways to spend an afternoon. So,
100%.
So there's so much you're involved in that I'm excited for, man. I do love to see, how much success you're having on Amazon. I love that. And anytime you post something that shows that you're eclipsing some of these more, stalwart evangelical people, I'm like, that just must piss them off. And
they don't care. They don't. I mean, the only one I laugh about is when I go ahead of C.S. Lewis, and because my daughter has been in a Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe ballet a couple times. So I always bragged to her, and she just rolls her eyes and was like, yeah, he's been dead for like 50 years and he's still number one. I'm like, fine. It's like pre-teenagers. My God, they always have a comeback.
Yeah. It gets worse before it gets better, but it does get better. I promise you, both my daughters are in their 20s, and I like them a lot more now.
My daughter's great. She's just, she doesn't look like me. She looks like my wife, which is probably a good thing, but she has like my snark and my like activist bent. So which is great, but also sometimes like a bit much, especially for my wife to handle, like, because my daughter will sit there and like philosophically debate. And I'm like, she's kind of pulling one over on you, honey. Like,
sorry, but she's got a point.
I want to take your side, but like intellectually, I got to kind of go with her. And it's just funny. It's funny to have that dynamic with your kid when they're old enough to like be like autonomous to a point.
Yeah.
And it's like, oh, this is fascinating.
Yeah. Except that, at some point, you have to reconcile the fact that you're married to one of them. So
I sleep with one in my bedroom, and I got to live. So
I got that door gets closed, and you get to go. Okay, I'm sorry, sorry, man. Could you back me up one time?
Just one, damn it.
Well, this is awesome, Matt. I'm so excited for everything that's happening with you, man. I'm just we're just tickled pink. I love talking to you. You're a lot of fun. If you're listening, if you've made it this far and you haven't checked out, check out all the stuff, all of Matt's stuff in the bio. We'll leave stuff in the show notes, social media, books, essays. Support him on Patreon. Start throwing money at him. If you just randomly put money in an envelope and send it to him, he would appreciate that. And then maybe he could quit one of his 12 jobs and
just cash.
Just cash. Yeah, something untraceable. Dime bags of weed would be fine.
No, actually, I just came across like a lot of weed, so I'm good right now.
so he's good. He's set for that. But you can never have too much cash on hand. So
that's right.
All joking aside, guys like Matt who are doing this and trying to honestly eke out a living while doing 10 or 12 other things, man, could use all the support they can get. So in all seriousness, with all sincerity, buy the books, man.
Yes, thank you.
Help keep this guy putting out content that is relevant and interesting and good. So anyway, all right, I'm done being serious. Back to the jokes, man. All right, appreciate you, man.
All right, thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye.
All right.
Thank you for listening to This Is Not Church. Be sure to rate and review the podcast on your platform of choice. If you would like to partner with us, visit patreon.com/thisisnotchurch, where you will receive exclusive content such as early access to episodes, videos of upcoming episodes, and live Q&A sessions. Be sure to check out our Facebook group or follow us on Twitter and Instagram. All the links are in the show notes. We'll be back soon with another episode.